All right, should be recording now. Good morning, or wherever you are. It could be good afternoon by the time you tune into this. But happy that you're joining. My name is Justin. I am the pastor here at United Church of Lincoln, and you have stumbled on to Tiny Desk Devotion. This is something that, if you've watched the videos in the past, you know it came out of this desire to kind of stay connected in some form during the time of the pandemic. And it's kind of changed a little bit. We were going every day. Now it's just going a couple times. It was going live. Now we're doing it a little bit different, where it's premiering on YouTube. So it's just like everything. This is the learning process, and we'll have to keep tweaking as we go. But I appreciate you tuning in whatever sacred space you find yourself in. So for the last few weeks, we've been going through a book by Henry Nouwen called Discernment, and it's that kind of like fancy church word for like, how do I figure out how God is speaking to me right here and right now? How do I think about those things I'm feeling like moved to? And like maybe another one of those Christian terms that sometimes we flippantly throw out is like, how is the Spirit moving me? Well, it's just kind of engaging some of that to take into consideration all the things that would that would that would kind of call us, that kind of urges us to make certain decisions. So anyway, we're going through that. Last time we met, I had a toddler in the background, so it was pretty short. So today we'll probably do a little bit longer than what we did last week. But we're going to go and pick back up in Nouwen's work. And what I would suggest is always, if you hear something that sticks with you, hold on to it. Like, you don't have to rush past it. Make sure like you're getting something else. Like, always come back and watch the video later, but let's put some time and energy into, oh, what is that thought? What is that word? Why does that resonate with me? I think that is one of the keys to discernment. All right, so let's jump in here and let's see what how God's talking to us today. Nouwen picks up with this kind of we're gonna shift where it says God's time is timeless. Thomas Merton, look, he's back on Merton again. Thomas Merton identified the signs of the times as kairos. Now, if you come to church here, you've heard me talk of kairos time. It's this idea. It's not like, the linear time of, forwards and backwards, but there's a sense of something like a change, like it's a kairos moment. And one that I always kind of point to is, you look at, the civil rights movement, all of a sudden it was like, there was like this movement that happened. Like there was a collective feeling that there was something going on, something was moving. And people recognized it and jumped on it. And I would even say that now we are in the midst of a kairos moment. So kairos, a quality of time that is eternal, when time is full of meaning and events point to a divine purpose. In one of the many reflections on the topic, he wrote, the Bible is concerned with time's fullness, the time for an event to happen, the time for an emotion to be felt, the time for a harvest or for a celebration of harvest. The Bible can be a good guide for our interpretation of events as we look to discern what God is doing, and remember that God's design and final purpose is that God's will ultimately reign and God's way of love will prevail. God's ways are not always our ways. God's timetable is not always our timetable. I'll make a little note there. A timetable discernment calls us to settle into God's ways of measuring time. Clock time, chronos. I don't know. I used to work in a factory, so chronos was the system that was used to like punch in and out of. Chronos time is divided into minutes, hours, and days and weeks, and compartments dominate our life. In chronological time, what happens to us is a series of disconnected incidents and accidents that we seek to manage or subdue to feel in control of our lives. Time becomes a burden unless we convert it into God's time. God's time, kairos time, has to do with the opportunity and fullness of meaning, moments that are right for the intended purpose. When we see, I don't want to do that. When we see time in light of our faith and in God, in the God of history, we see that the events of this year are not just a series of happy or unhappy events, but part of the shaping hands of God, who wants to mold our world and our lives. Even when life seems harried and continues to have hard moments, we can believe that something good is happening amid all of this. We glimpse of how God might be working out his purposes in our days. Time becomes not just something to get through or manipulate or manage, but the area of God's good work in us. Whatever happens, good things or bad, pleasant or problematic, we ask, what might God be doing here? We see the events of the day as continuing occasions to change the heart. Time points beyond itself and begins to speak to us of God. God's time is timeless. Kairos contains both past and future events in the present moment. Words like after and before or first or last, I got something for that too, belong to mortal life. And words like after and before or first or last belong to mortal life chronology. God is all in all, the beginning and end of time and the deeper meaning of history. To gain this wider perspective, we first look backwards to see how the seemingly unrelated events of our lives have brought us to where we are now. Like the people of Israel who repeatedly reflected on their history and discovered God's guiding hand in the many painful events that led them to Jerusalem, so we pause to discern God's presence in the event that we have made or unmade for us. For by now remembering, we allow forgotten memories to intrude into the present and become independent forces and crippling effects of our life. Forgetting the past is like turning our most intimate teacher against us. Remember the past in the ways Remembering the past in this way allows us to live in the present and to gain hope for the future until chronos is converted into kairos. This way of time helps us practice patience and discernment. If we are patient, we can look at all the events of each day, expected and unexpected, as holding promise for us. Patience is the attitude that says we cannot force life, but have to let it grow in its own time. Patience let us see the people we meet, the events of the day, and the unfolding history of our times as all parts of that slow process of development and final liberation. Given the nature of kairos, let's take a look at how certain events, critical events, current events, historical events, and even life circumstances can serve as the signposts pointing to the will of God and the new creation for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. Okay, so we're going to stop there because I think there's a lot of good things we can kind of parse out of this. And so it's a short reading, but there's a lot going on here and stuff that I definitely want to speak to. So one of the first things that kind of jumped out to me is really in the first opening paragraph where it says, God's design and final purpose is that God's will ultimately reigns and God's way of love will prevail. God's ways are not always our ways. Now, this is something that I get what Nowen is saying. And of course, you're talking about trying to understand a divine being that operates totally different than us. And yet for what I would say most Christians, or those kind of falling under that label, would say that they know the personhood or have the personhood of God, or this nature of God has been revealed in the person of Christ. So there's a mixed thing there because you have this humanity of Jesus that plays into the divinity of Christ. 100% human, 100% divine at the same time. So when I hear those words like God's ways are not always our ways, I always feel like they come at the worst times for people. And so usually when some kind of catastrophe happens or some kind of tragedy comes in, someone's like, well, God's ways just aren't our ways. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, of course they're not. But at the same time, that's usually a scapegoat sentence. And I think when we use that, it has to be some unpacking. It can't be, the discernment process is you can't just toss that out there for every time something happens and you're like, well, I just can't explain it because God's ways just aren't our ways. No, we can't do that. Or we shouldn't do that, or we shouldn't be so quick to jump to that. Because what I think it can happen is that when we give that impression of to people who are walking beside us, who are discerning it, in their own way, in their own time, it can be very problematic. Like, I was going through this and somebody just told me that that's just kind of the way it is and I got to deal with it, and how God has used me. I'm going through the suffering and God's allowing it because my ways aren't his ways. And no, there's more to it than that. So anyway, I wanted to stop there. I get what Nowen is saying, but yeah, let's unpack that a little bit because sometimes we don't unpack it enough. All right. The other thing is what I really like is he says God's time is timeless. He talks about kairos, time containing both past and future events in the present moment. So I really like that. And I could throw that through a lens or understanding of salvation, how salvation is an ongoing thing. It has past ramifications, while at the same time it has future ramifications. And then they all kind of play out within the present, which we're experiencing. You can look at it that way. I think of the cross being the same thing, that the cross just happened. It happened yesterday, but it has implications for today, and it's going to have some kind of divine future of the way things kind of shake out. So I like that. I like that talk. So anyway, I talk of kairos. I think the cross. I think Jesus going to the cross was a kairos moment that it holds significance. It was a movement. I know some people get really caught up on the time that Jesus, there's mention of in the Gospels, the time, it's chronological, which is important, I guess, for documentation purposes. But I think of the feeling, the things that led up to that moment. That's where you get a greater sense of what's happening. All right, and then I feel like there was one other thing that I saw. Where was it? Did I not write it down? I thought I did. Um, oh, he goes and talks about like the history of things, and like I think that's um, a big point people are making right now within our country. We're watching um, what some would consider honoring historical markers, statues being removed down. Now, I don't know how that's really shaken out up here in New England, but it's certainly shaken out down in the South, where there's a lot of Confederacy monuments that are up there. Um, and so I think that language, that idea of like erasing history, is very sensitive to some and how they view that history. Um, for not going into too much detail, because I know we keep these videos kind of short, it's you have some people who say that is historical, that is honoring some people, that there's that, and then there's another group that's saying like, yeah, that might be our history, but there's a chunk of that history of why these things went up that we are not discussing. And if you want to leave them up there, you need to put something on there that says this is why they went up. There was some maybe some insidious, nefarious reasons of why they erected these monuments. But if we don't talk about them, if we don't document somewhere, whether we change how we talk about those monuments, or how we change how we talk about our history, or add to, or put them in a museum, or do something where we address the fuller scale and let other voices come in to kind of say, yeah, this is what we had with. We're not trying to rewrite history, but we're trying to add to the narrative of of, uh, of a history that was presented to us only through a certain way. And so I think you have to take into that account of what that is. And so I think now is giving us that opportunity to say, hey, you have to look at your history, you have to pause and discern it, you have to keep telling that story. And what you see within the biblical narrative, within Scripture, is that you see constantly there is this opportunity, like we're going to tell about, remember when we were slaves in the land of Egypt. And then you have this really cool encounter with Jesus later on in the gospel text where Jesus is talking to the religious leaders, and they're like, when have we ever been slaves? Like, when did this ever happen to us? It's like, wow, they kind of forgot the story, right? So anyway, I think that's important to as you move forward, as you live in the present, move forward in the future. There's this call for us and our discernment and how we make future steps to think about where we started at and where we're coming from, and how that plays into the decisions that we make. All right, so that's it for this Tiny Desk Devotion. Hopefully you got something to think about, something to discern. So what we'll do is we'll come back on Thursday and kind of pick up in this area and see what some of the things we were talking about, like critical events, current event, historical events, life circumstances. He kind of goes into a little bit more detail. So I look forward to doing that with you all, and we'll see you on Thursday. Thanks. Stay happy, healthy, and home if you can. All right. Thanks, everybody.